The events leading up to today's story are filled with tragedy and horror. How could Jesus be the Messiah, the Son of God, God's beloved one in whom God was well pleased, only to be betrayed? How could he have stood there, transfigured, bathed in light on a mountaintop, flanked by Moses and Elijah, only to be arrested like a common criminal or a political dissident? Jesus, the embodiment of God's own glory, who only a week ago entered Jerusalem triumphant with the waving of palm branches, the cheering crowds, the parade, the hope, and then the arrest, the crucifixion, the cruelty, the violence, the broken body, the taunting, the way he cried out, and the darkness of the sky at the end. His followers were confused. Honestly, we are confused much of the time. Maybe it's just too hard to imagine, or maybe we don't want to imagine it. Like the disciples, most of us want to win in the classic sense of the word, to overthrow our enemies, to be raised to glory. We are, after all, human. We try to avoid pain. We let our egos guide us. We prefer to think in absolutes. Jesus warned us, but his warnings were hard to accept, because if this could happen to Jesus, what does that say about God? What does it say about the world? Where do we go from here? The Sabbath has passed, and a new day, a new week begins. 3 women, Mary Magdalene, Mary, mother of James, and Salome, arise early to begin the work yet undone, anointing their beloved teacher's broken body. The text for this morning is written in what is known as the historical present tense. While the NRSV translation that Tim just read in verse 2 reads, "And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they went to the tomb." A more literal translation of the Greek text would be, "And very early on the first day of the week, when the sun had risen, they come to the tomb." This tense, it draws the readers into the present time of a story that is still unfolding. We too are witnesses, even participants, alongside the women in those early hours of that fateful morning in the action of coming to the tomb. On their way, the women discuss the difficulty of moving the stone covering the entrance of the tomb. But when they look up, they see the stone, which was very large, has already been rolled back. And entering the tomb, they see a young man sitting on the right side, dressed in a white robe, and they are alarmed. But he says to them, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus, who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here. Look, there is the place they laid him. But go, tell. There you will see him, just as he told you." Go, tell. That is what we are being invited. Indeed, Jesus had told them. At the Passover meal, he had promised, "But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." The stranger's words remind the women, remind us that we were supposed to expect this, though the horror of witnessing it made it feel impossible. And then we get to that last line of the reading, which says, "So they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them." Terror and amazement, or as one of my professors, Dr. Barbara Lundblad, translates it from the Greek, thromos, trauma, and ekstasis, ecstasy. Trauma and ecstasy had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. This is the original ending of Mark's gospel, in which the story ends in silence and Jesus never appears. Now, I specify it's the original ending because later, 100 years or more later, an additional ending was tacked onto the story. an ending which includes Jesus appearing to Mary Magdalene and several other disciples and then ascending to heaven. It is admittedly a more comforting ending, one which answers the questions about what comes next, about hope, about how we can know that God is at work. But it is not the ending that Mark wrote. The ending, as we heard this morning, is far less certain. It leaves us with a biblical cliffhanger of sorts. Now, perhaps at this moment, you're rethinking your decision to come to Easter worship. Why is this pastor complicating a perfectly lovely story? This is supposed to be a day of lilies and alleluias, of floral prints and nice hats and chocolate eggs. And yet here we are, stuck with an unsettling ending. Here we are, just like the disciples. We have awakened to a world that is yet imperfect. There is violence, more of it than any of us would like. There is cruelty. There is uncertainty with the economy, with the government, with the climate, with our health, or that of the people we love. Many of us arrive to this day just as confused as the disciples, wondering where God is in all of this, how to make sense of this messy, unresolved moment. But here's a hard truth. To be alive is to navigate each day without knowing how the story will end. It can feel anxious, can feel precarious. But I think, I believe, I trust that this is where God meets us in the story. When they went to the tomb, the women were seized by trauma from all they had lived, from all they had witnessed, from all we have witnessed collectively. But they were also seized by ecstasy, because the tomb was empty. The stone was rolled away, and where a body should have been, there was instead an empty space, a pregnant pause, a surprised inhale, a new possibility, one which hadn't existed only moments before. The angelic presence said to the woman, "Do not be alarmed. You are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He has been raised. He is not here." Or as my friend, Reverend Alexis Fuller Wright puts it, don't get stuck in the past because God is not there anymore. Jesus has left the tomb and is already out ahead, waiting for you. But if I'm being honest, sometimes the past isn't easy to let go of, and the future isn't so easy to trust. As I read the story this week, I found myself repeatedly thinking back to a moment that took place 9.5 years ago, when against all odds, I found myself looking at a positive pregnancy test. After many years of infertility and heartbreak, after countless unsuccessful medical procedures, and after learning that it was not easier to hope, there was the appearance of that faint blue line. In that moment, of course, I still didn't know if the pregnancy would hold or who that possibility would grow into. And still, that faint blue line invited me to let go of the past and walk towards an unknowable future. I saw that line, and in that moment, something happened. Time became elastic, the space between my breaths stretching as I internally recalibrated, and whole new worlds of possibility blossomed forth in my mind. Maybe, perhaps, could it be? As I turned to my partner, Piper, I saw my ecstasy mirrored. For a while, like the women leaving the tomb, we did not tell anyone. Terror and amazement, trauma and ecstasy. We held this new possibility close to our hearts, even as it began to transform our reality. What had once appeared to be a dead end became a path leading towards an unknowable future, a future I have loved watching unfold in my daughter Tovi. Now, of course, this is just one of many ways that what can look like a dead end can blossom into new life. Not everybody's story, not even everybody's story of becoming a parent looks anything like mine. And yet, this story made me wonder, on this Easter morning in 2025, where are the dead end places in your life, or the dead end places in the world around you? Where might you feel terror or carry trauma as a result of what you have lived or borne witness to? Where have you given up hope? What are the endings, good or bad, that are directing the way you are living out your story? Where might you be stuck in the past? I invite you to think about that, really tangibly think about it. If you have a pen, you can even write it down. Where are you stuck? Acknowledge the stuckness. Honor the despair. Capture that fear. Notice it. And now, ask yourself, are you open to amazement or even ecstasy? Are you open to the possibility of God already being out ahead of you, drawing you towards something new in your life or in our world? Man, that's a hard question. That's a hard question. Hoping is hard. This week I listened to a podcast which challenged me profoundly. The host, Sam Sanders, was interviewing a marine biologist, Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, whose new book about climate change is called "What If We Get It Right?" What if we get it right? Dr. Johnson's point is that when we think about big problems like climate change, we often attempt to activate and mobilize people by engaging in catastrophic thinking. If we don't get this right, terrible things are going to happen. It's not a lie. The stakes are incredibly high. But rather than motivating people into action, an overload of fear causes many of us to feel helpless and completely shut down. Consciously or not, many of us avoid thinking about that which is scary or unpleasant. Or maybe we've experienced so much scary and unpleasant in our lives that we get stuck there, doom scrolling, reading the news with mounting despair, but unable to imagine any other possibility, unable to act. You see, while fear may activate our fight, flight, or freeze response, it rarely unlocks our creative gifts or potential. It rarely helps us to envision future thriving or wholeness. And Dr. Johnson believes that we need to access each and every one of our strengths if we are to find and build and co-create solutions. She wonders how you, as a teacher, a dancer, a comedian, an artist, a musician, a parent, a retiree, a pastor, how you can leverage your gifts in service of a world that you want to live in. Rather than getting mired down in what happens if we get it wrong, she invites us to imagine what it would look like to get it right. She says, you cannot possibly work towards something you aren't even open to imagining. And we may not be able to imagine every detail of the kingdom, but without vision, we are lost. So we have to start imagining outside of the box that fear has got us stuck in. Okay, so now I'm going to invite you to go back to that dead end or those dead end places that you thought of earlier. Those places you carry trauma, despair, those places that you have given up hope. Can you begin to imagine what it would look like, what it would feel like to get it right? Are you open to the possibility? Are you open to the possibility of new life? For example, what would it look like in your relationship with your relative who has totally different political beliefs than you to get it right? Could there be a path forward that doesn't rely on either of you changing your fundamental core beliefs, but a path that still allows you to remain connected and to care for one another? Or what would it look like to get it right in caring for your elderly parent who is in decline? What would a beautiful next step in the unfolding look like? What would allow you not to deny the hard parts, but to experience blessing, even here and even now? What would it look like for you to get it right in your relationship with your own health? I'm not asking what would make you a champion ultramarathoner, but what would getting it right feel like in your body today? What support do you need to do right by yourself? Self-compassion? Motivation? Deep rest? Time with friends? Joy? Play? What would it mean to get it right on your own behalf, starting now in some small way? Here's one more. What would it look like to get it right as a community? What would it look like to get it right on behalf of your immigrant neighbor? What would it look like to get it right on behalf of the single parent at your child's school? What would it look like to get it right on behalf of the unhoused person down at Lincoln Park? What does succeeding look like if it's not about personal success, but about collective thriving? What does it look and feel like if we, all of us, were to get it right together? I want to leave you with one final story this morning. Reverend Ben has spoken before about Edwina Gately, who describes herself as a mystic and a social activist. She's a poet, she's a theologian, and she's the founder of Genesis House in Chicago, which describes itself as a place of hospitality and nurturing for women involved in prostitution. Edwina says her life has been a rhythm of extended periods of prayer and solitude and engaged activism in community. I love that. We also see that in Jesus' life, right? Prayer and solitude, and then engaged activism in community. And she says through both, her understanding and experience of God and church has been radically challenged and reshaped. Her vocational story starts when at age 21 she became a missionary because she wanted to, quote, save the world. She envisioned herself teaching poor people across the African continent about God, whom at the time she imagined to be white, British, and male. A God who fit neatly into her own English Catholic worldview. But upon arriving in Africa, she says the biggest shock was to find out that God had gotten there before her. She thought she had gone to teach others, but instead, the hospitality of people who welcomed her into their home and their culture over the course of 3 years, well, Edwina learned more about God than she ever could have hoped to teach. She says, our calling is to journey on faithfully, and as we do that, God grows. God gets bigger, until our definitions are no longer big enough for a divine presence that we can't even begin to understand. Edwina imagined sharing the love of God as a missionary, but things went differently than she expected. She was stretched, she was challenged, she was loved, she was transformed. And from that experience, she went on to create a volunteer mission movement that has sent thousands of folks into exchanges around the world to offer their gifts, but more importantly, to connect with people different from themselves who illuminate other aspects of God's love. God gets bigger until our definitions are no longer big enough. When the women discovered the empty tomb, it started them down an unknown path. Before long, others would join them, some of whom had previously traveled with Jesus, the radical rabbi who upended their worldviews. None of them could fully understand his teachings until he was crucified but not extinguished by the violence of the world. While it wasn't the story he had imagined or hoped for, well, it wasn't the story they had imagined or hoped for. In the months and years that followed, a new question emerged. What if it wasn't a mistake? What if Jesus had gotten it right? Past person to person, the Christ-light continued to grow, making its way across the globe, and thousands of years later, it is here, in this very sanctuary, among so many other places, in a church that is still upsetting social norms by preaching radical welcome and God's unfettered love. This path, passed down through generations, has not been an easy one, but God was always out ahead, opening a new way. The women did not need to understand exactly how it would all unfold, only that a stone had been rolled away, and what was left was an empty space big enough to hold their hope. Christ is risen. Hallelujah and amen.